Welcome to Energy Bites with ELS. This is our fifth episode, and with me today I have our market analyst, Sid, and our co founder, Samuel. We have a lot to go through today, so I'm just gonna start off, if that's all right with you guys.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Brilliant. So, landing very briefly in Åland, we've spoken about the policy developments in Finland before, them introducing a new tendering system, a law which is now enacted, and the government is looking to launch the first offshore wind tender, I think, this autumn already. But there's been some developments there. The issue has issued a call for a commercial advisor to oversee the auction process, and this builds on the 2021 Maritime Spatial Plan with the goal of developing up to 4 gigawatts of offshore wind. And that's around 30% of Finland's currently electricity output. And of course, this project is still in its early stages, with applications set to be submitted to the European Commission sometime during 2026. So, some possible developments in our eastern neighbors. And I can see Sam raising his hand. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, on needles there. But actually, it is very interesting, and I think it ties into just last week. We also heard that Nordion and a group of other TSOs, so Nordion being from Sweden, a group of other Nordic TSOs were, their application for EU funding. For the big sort of Baltic hydrogen connector, a potential pipeline running from in the waters from the north of Sweden, Finland, in Bothnia Bay, past Åland, connecting to Åland, and then sort of going southwards all the way down to Germany. But they got like 500 million Swedish krona, I think about 50 million euros. So, I mean, that was very big news, actually. And I think it just underlines the kind of that we're still in a situation where kind of the Swedish government is doing their own thing. The EU is doing and financing something different, which is an interesting situation.
It is definitely. And, the Danish hydrogen pipeline was stalled, I think, mid last year, but their export plans are getting a fresh push. I mean, after this delay, the government is reinitiating efforts to establish that
Hmm.
first pipeline stretch to Germany.
Yes.
And Energinet had previously pushed for a timeline around 31, which is far beyond the 2028 target. But the Danish government is now increasing its funding and lowering the booking requirements to get that
Yeah.
first initial wave moving. So they're committing over 1 billion Danish krona.
And this is very interesting. And we said before the podcast, we're not going to talk that much about these issues, but about other issues. But actually, I think we should get a bit drawn into this because, after a good few years of hydrogen bonanza that came last year, which was kind of, like nothing happened. People were like, giving it is so expensive. I mean, look at that Danish pipeline, for instance. Some people were sort of almost laughing in jest, others were mourning. But, firstly, these two projects, the Danish pipeline and the Baltic hydrogen connector, that is like apples and pears, right? Time wise. The Danish pipeline, pretty fast to build, pretty near term project. Clearly, the market wasn't there yet. Clearly, the incredible targets that the EU set up and Germany and a lot of other member states were unrealistic. Where we should be in 2025 when they first set many of those targets around 2020, but then 27, 28, etc. Things are happening, funding is happening, and now the Danes are okay, so they are 2.5 years behind. Well, so you could say so is everybody, right? At least. Of course, the Baltic Hydrogen Connector is a massive project, a potential project, which is much further down the line. So, it's not that strange that we sort of that we see that kind of discrepancy. But the Danes actually moving fairly quickly. It seems still see some form of business basis for it, obviously. So very interesting, and of course the funding from the EU rolling out.
I think you're
Yeah.
completely right about that, Samuel. It's not strange at all. And we talked about that briefly about the recalibration of the state in order to sort of get these green projects online. But I saw that you wanted to step in, said.
Yes, I mean, on the topic of, well, the hydrogen economy, looking at Denmark specifically, there still remains a very firm strategy in place for production of hydrogen and sending it southwards, especially from huge investments in offshore wind. Recently, Denmark has scrapped the subsidy free auctions that they had planned and are now putting potentially money on the table for supporting a build out of offshore wind, which would feed the hydrogen economy. And in Finland as well, I mean, we see pretty clear strategy of providing an environment for investments to go forward in hydrogen production, hydrogen products such as methanol, as we see more and more activity in that field. So it's really the clarity that businesses have that allows them to move forward with projects and coming up with new plans, even though there are setbacks on some. So the hydrogen economy remains firmly in place where there is this sort of clarity.
Yeah, I mean, we discussed this previously about the failed 6 gigawatt offshore wind tender, and as you said the Danish government sort of has concluded that the current no subsidy model isn't working under today's market conditions, and therefore one is very unashamed that that one just concludes that okay, this isn't working, and we now have to retender 3 gigawatts, down from the original six, and it is very difficult in this day and age to get things completely right from the start.
I think that puts it very, very, very well. Actually, you have to sort of try and test your way forward, prod your way forward. I think that's the word, right? To understand the market and where the market is. The market is shifting so quickly. Geopolitics, economy is shifting so quickly right now. How can a government formally ask its agencies to come up with a plan, come up with a strategy for a particular bidding round, and then think that's going to be entirely on top of the market movements? I mean, it's bound not to be hard for governments to capture all those of tosses and turns of economy right now, the market. Just look at the last few years, COVID, then the war, everything. I mean, we've seen all such very big changes. So I think it's very it's very daring, but very good. Exactly what should be done when you sort of run these programs of test the market and be ready to accept. Well, right now we squeezed the thumb screws a bit too tight. Business did not take the bait. We didn't get any bidders. Well, much less taxpayer money lost by doing that than by being too overly generous and always make sure that you have a full sort of bidding card.
I agree totally because it's very one of the issues perhaps with feedback from the market is the long timelines that it's a long process, and we saw that happen in Denmark, that feedback from the market filtered into the policy direction, but without such speed as perhaps might be more relevant and important now in these turbulent times when it comes to trade. Like that sort of strategy coming from government and state side needs to be fairly quick to adapt to changes in the market with a faster way to do so.
And I think that speed is really necessary when you run a CFD scheme. That speed and that kind of listening to the market, testing the market, and not being afraid of testing too hard. I mean, the UK is doing something similar now. There were talk last week that because of the low results previously, now they will change the terms a bit. They will look over the terms. I mean, this needs to be done in order to get a CFD scheme to work very well. And I think that's sort of, I think later on we'll talk a bit about Sweden, and where, of course, the government is looking to use CFDs to fund nuclear, and maybe here, as at least as an outline idea lies for that scheme, it does not really look to be that flexible and that sort of quick moving, which could be yet another worry perhaps when it comes to how those money will be optimally, those taxpayer money will be optimally spent.
Yeah, let's move into Sweden. Actually, I can just briefly mention that the Dutch and the German government alike has released their offshore wind plans for 2026 and onwards. But as we discussed before, the government is moving to streamline both this nuclear but also the environmental permitting. And one of the big proposals is that a new central authority will take full control of the environmental assessments, replacing the current decentralized system led by the county administrative board, making a shift towards a more centralized policy in line with the EU requirements. But then, of course, last Friday came a very interesting proposal by the nuclear coordinator, Carl Berglof, creating a state-owned nuclear investment company to sort of ensure the knowledge transfer and standardization. Basically, an industrial copy paste approach. The plan is to scale up quickly, maximize learning, and then sell off the company once the market catches on. So, the big question is, can the state run this efficiently without creating a slow, semi commercial hybrid? Is it worthwhile moving away from the market here?
I think it's hard not to be struck by the irony. Sort of, we moved full circle, right? You know, when you have a centre-right government proposing a government entity, a government-owned corporation, in order to increase efficiency and get things done faster than it is believed now, so that the private sector could do. So, you know, that irony is of course hard not to comment on. I think historically, of course, you know, we had deregulation, we had free markets brought in order to increase efficiency and increase sort of speed, and indeed, you know, in a sense, what we just discussed about Denmark, and with a short segue to the UK, that flexibility seems to be good and bring sort of have the potential to bring efficiency for the taxpayer. Here we sort of see something different. I mean, the core problem of building up a know-how base and all that, that is a key challenge to try to meet. But it's very interesting, and I struggle to see sort of just that there isn't a very big risk, both that you actually create the very classic inefficiencies, which, you know, historically actually have been associated with government organizations, but also that you end up creating a new entity that, in effect, is competing with the private sector and private sector actors. So I see a lot of pitfalls, and only a strong benefit in a very particular area, which would be the know-how area, of course.
Absolutely. I can see that time is sort of running out slowly. I think we were going to come back to this topic in another podcast. But moving into markets, Ed, please help us out.
So we were talking briefly about the CFDs and systems in several places, and how a good, well-designed system is very helpful for encouraging investment. And we see that happening right now in Poland, with Ørsted having taken a final investment decision on a 1.5 gigawatt offshore wind farm, which they plan to have first power already by 2027. So this is a very positive development, especially given the financial troubles that Ørsted has had over the past year or so, and speaks well for the investment climate in Poland, as well as all of the conditions which are in place to encourage that to have gone forward.
Yeah, very good point, I think. I mean, the Poles here have come up with I would want to say, actually, maybe the most attractive CFD scheme in Europe right now, and on a 25-year contract length, which is great given the geopolitical tensions in the area. The Poles obviously see a strong opportunity moving forward with these projects, despite that, in contrast to the Swedes, for instance. But it's very interesting to sort of see those terms and what they've done. And it's, I mean, also from Ørsted's perspective, or looking at Ørsted, it's interesting. I mean, they spent most of last year cutting away projects, trying to minimize the exposure, getting back into a workable portfolio. And this is clearly where they're now sort of putting the gunpowder that they dried out. Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, I think it speaks very well for sort of the strategic vision that the country has in terms of fostering a certain direction of the energy system with certain specific goals in mind, but also putting forward the conditions to achieve those goals. And the clarity on that is what lets market actors really take these decisions to move forward. And in other locations, there's often confusion as to really what the long-term strategy will be. And those long or large changes in strategy can really wash away investments that have already been made. And market actors don't like that. That's not very helpful for taking investment decisions. And we see contrasts across the Baltic Sea. Um, uh,
Yeah.
I mean, speaking from the side of a state, of course, states would not want to risk too much. And we see risk sharing systems which are sort of balanced, such as in Estonia, where they are coming up with a new CFD scheme themselves, but with a limit as to how much the state can fund. While by contrast, Lithuania, where the CFD has been postponed multiple times, and most recently with a view to evaluate how much risk the state can take on. So that gives actually a tremendous lack of clarity when investment decisions are to be made. If the position of the state can shift so strongly, that confusion is something that doesn't help.
And I mean, I really agree. Very strong points, actually. And in Poland, for instance, you also have that political unity in an otherwise rather disunited polity. I think everybody sort of has heard about it over the last few years. Is the polarization in Poland, but about energy, about defense, they have come together, and there's very strong sort of sense that they are going to build both nuclear, both offshore wind, doing some other things also, of course. And then it's a country that's been rebuilding their armed forces very strongly, of course, for a longer time. I think it particularly when you look at Sweden and the dearth both for offshore wind as well as other parts of the energy sector, of course, it's quite clear that our politics are still very, jittered, very sort of seem scared throughout all sides of the political spectrum, actually, of kind of moving into and working in this new arena and how international politics of the surrounding area actually looks now.
Before we end, the last episode we talked at length about the EU and the US trade situation, and there's been updates on that. Trump's tariffs on Mexico and Canada, and possible tariffs on the EU, and that have led the EPP to be a bit hesitant on CBAM. And you said you've had some insights on that.
Of course. So the European People's Party is proposing to delay the implementation of CBAM by 2 years. And that would include lightening the reporting requirements which are currently in force. But generally speaking, it's a postponement of burdensome green policy in general on companies in order to prevent harming European industry too much, especially given the current situation with trade barriers and tariffs being implemented pretty much unilaterally by Donald Trump in the US on neighbors, allies, and other countries alike. There's a certain movement in the political economic spheres to change to a wait and see approach, to maintain the flexibility that might come in handy in order to respond to these very, very large waves in a pragmatic way that still preserves industrial competitiveness in Europe. And this is all the more important given that China is having a certain dominance in several green technologies for the time being. There has to be a balance within the EU's approach. And this is one way of feeling out what's an efficient way to do that.
I think this is, clearly the EU is in a pickle. I mean, we talked about it at length last time. The growth rates are just, I mean, they're dismal, and there's a lot of problems. And particularly, I mean, a lot of it has to do with energy for continental Europe in particular, where we're sort of still reliant on imports from countries where we wouldn't necessarily want to import from, or now maybe increasingly so, maybe much increasingly so from the US, which is, of course, an allied country, but coming with a sort of after a certain bit of coercion, which is never ideal. And I think, I mean, one thing you can say, it's quite natural and it's quite good for European politicians to look how they can preserve their room for maneuver. That is essential in this case. We might need to put duties back sort of as an answer to Trump. Well, in that case, we may have to make sure that not everything maybe becomes more expensive through CBAM at the same time. But I think, it's if we now sort of start to dither and just kind of back off completely from the transition, well, then we will continue to be an import-dependent energy union, sort of with the EU speak, right? We will not build that kind of own capacity, which would actually be good and would benefit us both economically in the long run, as well as geostrategically. And we will sort of continue to be very much at the mercy. Of course, Chinese technology dominance is a big problem, and I think that is a question, how and what to do. But we have to make sure that not everything gets incredibly expensive at the same time. So, can we be pragmatic in regards to that in some way without building in Chinese dependence and Chinese technologies into our critical technological frameworks? I mean, what do you guys think?
Yeah, an important point to note is the Chinese technological dominance as we see it. Is we see the results now, but in fact, it's the result of quite a long term strategic focus of that country. From the European perspective, of course, it's important not to become too dependent on imports. We've seen that historically. At the same time, there's much to be gained from ensuring a certain amount of both trade and knowledge sharing. Barriers to trade, of course, make things more expensive overall, globally. And we just find ourselves in a world today where that is considered to be the way forward by many such countries. But we shouldn't forget that it's important to have a balance there as well without getting too deep into the mechanics of it. But yeah, Europe, I think, has an opportunity to be pragmatic. But of course, it's very much important to have a strategy in dealing with other countries without being too, not coming from too much of a moral high ground in terms of how to carry out trade, but be certainly pragmatic in dealing with our trading partners.
I think there's a couple of very good points there, actually. In fact, I mean, firstly, they had a long-term strategy. We didn't really, and we're paying the price for that. Maybe it's time now to stop dithering and just kind of, throw our latest strategy over the board because this one didn't work out either, and come up with a completely new one. For one, secondly, yeah, maybe if a lot of the technology we build in Europe is like 30, 50, 70% more expensive than Chinese machinery. Well, what can we buy in order to sort of buy as much as we can? And maybe we need to be a bit more, do to China what they did to us then. Maybe we need to relearn the technology they took from us, so to speak, and perfected, and relearn that back. Maybe that's what we need to do. That's maybe not the best sort of IP law friendly approach, but maybe that would be a way forward, right?
Absolutely, and the clean industrial deal is set to be released on the 26th of February, if I'm not mistaken. And of course, I mean, high energy prices in the EU relative to other advanced economies are making it harder for companies in the bloc to compete with foreign rivals. And it won't be CBAM that's going to revive European industry. It's clean and cheap energy. And this is something that the EU Commission needs to take into account when it designs its industrial policies. But I think we're going to end on that note. Sid, is there anything that we should keep an eye on?
Yes, we will be keeping our eyes certainly on the evolution of not just trade barriers, but also trade policy and industrial policy that would go with it.
Absolutely. And, while Sweden is pushing hard for its nuclear expansion, the timeline is slipping, according to the nuclear coordinator. Berlöv remains skeptical about the 2035 timeline. And something that we at ELS will keep an eye on is how will the government try to sort this out? Those are the big questions. All right, I think we've been going on for long enough. This was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.